Well, Adrian, I think for the sake of time, if it's okay, we'll just sort of jump straight into the subject tonight. And yeah, obviously, you know, it's a wonderful season for you guys right now, just being blessed with that beautiful little girl. But life hasn't always been easy for you either. And in fact, you had some quite relatively rare challenges right from day one, actually, didn't you? So tell us a bit about that.
So, is the mic on? My mum, when she was expecting me, had a water infection, and that meant that labour came much quicker than she'd anticipated. I was nearly 3 months early, actually. Now, some of you might say he's always been impatient right from the very beginning. That is probably true. But nearly 3 months early, and the result of that is that there were some complexities during my birth, and I was born with cerebral palsy. So that's predominantly affected the left side of my body. And when I was growing up, I had a much more pronounced problem with my legs. My left leg turned in quite severely. And I guess much of what happened at the beginning is a blur, because as a baby and as a toddler, you don't really remember much. But one of the things I do remember is having to go in and out of hospital on a regular basis and see this huge wad of notes. I mean, most people my age probably wouldn't have many notes in hospital, but I had a huge wad of notes. And I'd hear stories from my mum about how, you know, when I was a relative newborn, they'd have to hold me down and plaster my left leg to try and straighten it slightly. I guess one of the earliest memories I've got is that sense of frustration and sometimes that sense of anger of not being able to do what everybody else could do. I wasn't able to walk until I was about 3.5. I was brought up in Pontarddulais, and we had a dormer bungalow on Glynhir Road, and there was a long narrow corridor from the front door all the way to the living room. And my mother, who'd worked in the DVLA, she'd given up work, taken a career break to look after me because I had so many challenges. And I remember vividly my mother trying to negotiate this cumbersome wheelchair from the front door down this little narrow corridor into the front room. And I was just sitting there helpless, unable to get up and walk, and really feeling quite frustrated. So that was a challenge at the beginning. And I remember then that sense of anxiety that followed, because I think they quickly realised that wrapping my legs in plaster of Paris wasn't going to be enough, that I'd probably need to have a little bit of surgery. So very early on in my primary school years, they started to operate to try and straighten my left foot. And in some ways it was a bit of an adventure. It was something that nobody else was doing. But I also remember being absolutely terrified, sitting in Morriston Hospital with an anaesthetist, and I can barely say that word now, but as a young primary school pupil, it was all a bit overwhelming. And having to ponder, gosh, somebody's going to put me to sleep. Will I wake up again? I really didn't know. It was all quite overwhelming. And there was a series of surgeries that followed, and they were relatively successful in terms of getting me up on my feet. And after they'd straightened my left foot, there was that sort of challenge of having to learn to walk and not knowing if I'd be able to do it. But I've always been quite determined and very deliberate. And I always had this sense, I was brought up in a home where we didn't really go to church. My mum would sometimes say to the vicar of Pontarddulais, John, I'm really sorry we haven't been to church for such a long time, but there's been overtime in the DVLA later after she went back to work, and he'd sort of giggle and say, oh, that's okay, I've been working Sundays for years. So faith was never really a factor in my early years, but there was always this sense of being quite deliberate and determined. And if there was something that needed to be done, I was going to get it done. And so I would go to the gym every night. That may surprise you because I've got less than an athletic body now. Go to the gym every night and have physio to try and get up onto my feet and to learn to walk. And after a long and agonizing journey, I did just that. I was able to start to walk, and I remember that sense of relief that came. It's like learning a new skill. But there was always that sense, I can walk, but I don't quite walk like everyone else. And I guess I was never really aware of that because you can't see yourself walking. But from time to time, other people, if they wanted to be a bit cruel, would point it out. And I remember that being quite difficult as I was growing up. But in all honesty, despite the challenges, there was a very happy childhood, and I don't think that God ever inflicts these things on you, but he will always use the challenges you face. And I guess one of the biggest anxieties for my mum was actually beginning that new chapter where I'd have to go to school. And wind the clock back 30 years, and Welsh education was quite a new and novel thing. There were 12 people in my class when I started in Ysgol Bryn-Iago in Pontedilais, compared to, I think, 32 in the equivalent class in the English school. Now, my mum didn't speak a word of Welsh, and she says, even now, 37 years later, wi'n dysgu Cymraeg, I'm learning. So it was a big leap of faith, but she decided, having gone to speak to the headmaster, that I'd probably get more care and attention in Ysgol Bryn-Iago than I would in Pontedilais Primary School. So it was a huge leap of faith, and it was definitely one that would never have happened if I hadn't been born all those months early and had cerebral palsy. And I say that because in Ysgol Bryn-Iago, I had a Christian teacher, and she was a remarkable woman. She still lives in Pontedilais, Annie Derrick. And I remember you could do that 37 years ago. Every day we'd begin with a prayer, and there'd be a time in our day when we'd sit on the mat, except I would sit on a chair, and she'd read from the Bible, and she would tell us about Jesus. And I remember being quite intrigued by that, and as a youngster, primary school age, thinking about this person Jesus, and, you know, trying to work out, well, where does he fit in my life? And I guess at that stage, the answer was, well, he doesn't really fit, but he's sort of there. And if I hadn't gone to Ysgol Bryn-Iago, I'm not sure that he would have been. She was a remarkable person. She'd run around Pontedilais in a blue Ford Escort, picking up all the kids in creation. And on a Monday night, we'd have a kids club in the local chapel, Ebenezer Chapel. And again, we'd play games, board games. I wasn't able to, but we'd play football and rugby and various other things. And she would never miss the opportunity to tell us about Jesus. And she was somebody who wanted us to know that we were unbelievably loved. And I say that because there was, I guess, another dimension where I've always known that my mother and my father loved me incredibly. Forgive me, my wife will know I can, you know,
It's fine.
cry at the drop of a hat. I've always had this sense, you know, they love me unbelievably and they've always tried to do their best for me. But there were definitely times when they didn't love each other and life was extremely difficult. And there were times, I think, where I often wondered, well, you know, have I had a part to play in that? Because looking after somebody with the challenges that I had put an awful lot of stress and strain on their relationship. My dad was an electrician and he worked away. So they had rare opportunities to spend time together. And if I had been well, then I'm sure those times would have been very different. But often they were quite fraught because I was in and out of hospital. And sometimes even when things were going well, there were comical scenarios. I remember I'd had an operation to try and stretch the tendons in the back of my left leg. And afterwards they'd plastered my leg, and I was supposed to be in plaster for some time, but my leg started swelling. And my mum frantically rang Philip's Parade in those days. It was a children's hospital in Swansea. And they said, don't worry, pop him in the bath, the plaster will go soft, and you'll be able to cut it off with a conventional scissors. So after about half an hour in the bath, there was no shifting this. And my mum, again fraught, rings up the hospital and she says, he's been in the bath for over half an hour, it's not shifting. And they said, oh, give us a moment to look up his notes. And they came back and they said, last time he was in, we tried a new thing on him called fiberglass plaster. and that is waterproof. You know, there were often fraught times, although looking back they were funny. You know, my mum had this youngster soaking wet with dripping plaster, you know, going as fast as lightning down to Philip's Parade to have this cut off because my leg was swelling and I was in agony. So there were certainly times when family life was really tough, and God didn't really factor. But I think it was comforting having gone to Ysgol Bryn Iago and having a Christian teacher who would actively find every opportunity to share with us this sense of being unbelievably loved, no matter what. That was a sense of real strength. I didn't understand it. I couldn't really work out where it had a place in my life. But when my parents struggled to love each other, it was incredibly comforting to know, actually, I'm okay. We are loved and somebody is holding us. Fast forward then, I seem to be making, by the time I went to Ysgol Gyfun Gwyr, quite a lot of progress. I went to the Welsh secondary school in Gowerton, and things seem to be improving quite a bit. At least for me physically, my challenges, I seem to be overcoming them. The challenges my parents faced seemed, on the other hand, to be getting worse. And as a result, I remember there'd be times when I'd be farmed off to my grandparents who live here in Gorsainan. And my grandparents would go to church and they would take me with them. And that was a strange experience. It was definitely something I never did with my parents. My grandmother was the church warden. She was in church every Sunday, week in, week out. Looking back, and she'd kill me for saying this, I don't think they owned a Bible. They certainly never prayed. And I remember the challenges between my parents putting an awful lot of strain on them too. And looking back, I'm not sure really what difference going to church made for them. So that sort of puzzled me, and I used to think, well, apart from 60 minutes on a Sunday, what difference does this really make? And if I'm being honest, sometimes going to church, I found it a bit of an unedifying experience. It was more of a social club and a gossip shop than a place where I encountered Jesus, the kind of God that my school teacher had told me about. But I went because they went week in, week out, and I'd listen to the vicar preaching and sometimes think about what I had to do during the week or ponder what was for dinner that day. And it seemed almost as if there was sort of a storm carrying on around me. But again, I was puzzled. I didn't really know what difference it made and where its place was in my life. And it seemed to be a place where people went on a Sunday. There was this huge push to raise money on a regular basis, and if you could give more, that would be great because we've got bills to pay. And I thought, to be honest, I don't really see the point of it. And during that time, I found more solace in my school than I did in the church, by any stretch of the imagination. Ysgol Gyfun Gwyr, it was a remarkable place, and the teachers, they were like extended family members, and I threw myself into school life and loved it, and there'd be something every night, and again, you probably couldn't do this nowadays. There'd be too many safeguarding rules and regulations, but lots of the staff lived in the Bont, and so they would give me lifts home from school. And I had one teacher who was quite remarkable. He was a Welsh teacher, full of life and energy, and there was no doubt in my mind that when I left school, I wanted to go and study Welsh. And there was only one place to do that, really, and that was in Aberystwyth. And so I went off to Aberystwyth, and my vicar at the time, who was phenomenal, a man full of grace and patience, John Walters, I remember him telling me, go off to university and enjoy yourself. Do what the students do, And as somebody who'd spent lots of time with my grandparents, that was a bit of a shock to the system, but he was the vicar, so I took him at his word. And I want to share that with you again, because that, I guess, was the next big step for me on life's journey, going to Aberystwyth. And there was a church in the centre of Aberystwyth there. It was an Anglican church, just like the one I had always gone to at home with my grandparents. So one Sunday morning, when I was busy not doing anything else, I thought, I'm probably pretty safe to pop in there. And so I did, and it was completely unlike anything else that I've ever experienced in my life. It was far too rowdy, and the songs were unfamiliar, and some people had their arms up in the air, and within about 30 seconds, I had decided that these people were crackers. And that I'd been there and tried that, and I was never going to go again. So I would come home more often or not while I was at university during the early years, because the pub culture, the drinking and the partying, was never something that really sat very easily with me. So I would get the bus home, and my grandfather would come and pick me up. So again, I sort of struggled. I wasn't really sure, where any of this made sense or where God fitted. Until a friend of mine who was very brave in Aberystwyth, I think he could see this sort of intrigue that I had for Jesus, said to me, we're running a course called the Alpha Course. Why don't you come along? And I can remember it vividly. It was in the Orangery in Aberystwyth, and I've always sort of seen the world through my stomach, and the deciding factor for me was the fact that they were offering free food, and it was tremendous. And initially I was sceptical. I thought, it doesn't really make much sense, but I'm going to go along. And I remember meeting there people the same age as me, and that was a shock to the system, because anybody who I'd ever known who was a Christian was at least 60 years older than me. These guys were the same age as me. And I remember looking at them and realizing they've got something that's missing in me. I've gone to church, but these guys have got something that is different. It's not religion, it's a relationship. And it didn't really make sense at the time, but I knew that I wanted it. I knew that it was missing. And if this was going to make any difference, then I needed to pursue it more. I remember being on that course as an 18-year-old and having this sense of encounter. And it's strange, I wouldn't describe it as a religious Damascus Road experience, because I'd always had this sense that God was there, that he had me. But I always struggled, particularly in the ups and downs. I should say that, I forgot to also say that after I'd started to get this sense of being able to walk and getting myself on my feet, one of the things I did, because my grandmother told me it was time, was start to go to confirmation classes. And crossing the road to the vicarage where we had our confirmation classes, I was knocked over and nearly died. And the bones in my left leg were shattered. So there was this sense, oh gosh, it had taken me this long to learn to walk, and now I'm going to have to learn all over again. And I remember my first outing out after that experience, having survived it. Confirmation for me was a celebration, not because I was simply being confirmed, but because I was still alive. And I remember somebody saying to me, about a week before my confirmation, I don't know how you can believe in God after what you've been through. And I remember, that's a good question. I can't work it out. I don't know where it fits, but somehow I know that God has got me. So there on that Alpha course, it wasn't like a Damascus Road experience in a sense, because I'd always known that God was somehow there. But I guess for me, it had been like watching the television in black and white, and all of a sudden, it was like seeing it in HD in full colour. All of the pieces began to make sense. And I remember reading obscure parts of the Bible that had never really made sense to me. And it was almost as if I had this understanding that I'd never had before. And I guess there was this recognition, yes, life had been hard, there'd been lots of ups and downs, there'd been lots of suffering, but the Bible doesn't promise an easy life. The Bible doesn't promise a life without suffering. But the Bible does promise that in the middle of it, God is right there with you. And it's not simply that he's right there with you, but he's a God that knows something of that suffering for himself, because he chose to humble himself and take that suffering upon himself. And I guess I remember having this experience actually in the Baptist church in Aberystwyth, sitting there and pondering the cross and realizing he's right there. He's right there with me. He knows what suffering is. And because he suffered, I can look forward to a time when there is no longer suffering. And I guess to finish, I'm on my feet, I can walk. I live a relatively independent life. But there isn't a day that goes by when I'm not in pain in one way or another. Moving around is really very difficult. Some of you will know, Rob in the back there has been helping me recording the services online, and it's a bit of a standing joke between us now that just before I'm about to do something, I bend down and pull my socks up. And sometimes Rob says to me, "Have you forgotten something?" Last week I did that in front of our new bishop, and he says, "There's no need to bow down in front of me, I'm just a bishop." But the reason I do that is because I've got a scar going right the way down my left leg. And after surgery, that became infected. And it's left me with a condition called hypersensitivity. So when I'm moving about, as my trousers rubs against my legs, sometimes I want to jump through the roof. And I've learned to live with it, but it's so painful. And sometimes it's worse than other times. Sometimes I've got to ask my wife, and it's quite humiliating, to help me put my shoes on and to do my laces up. And I don't share that. I try to be a positive person, and I try not to complain. And I remember for a long time, I didn't meet Claire until I was way into my 30s. I'd only had one girlfriend before that for a very brief time. And I remember thinking, oh, well, my walking is cumbersome. It's not the most attractive of things. Will I ever find somebody who's dull enough to commit to me? And if I do, how am I going to explain to them that sometimes I can't bend down and put my laces on? For crying out loud, I'm only 30. But there's always been that sense for me that in suffering, we're not without hope. Because actually that cross is really significant, and it changes everything. Because it shows us that for the time being, we have a God who's right there with us and can be speaking into our suffering with real integrity because he knows what it means. But the story doesn't end there. We have a future hope beyond suffering. And I'm looking forward to a time when all my bones are made straight and I can leap like the deer in the field without having to worry about things like hypersensitivity and bad back pain and whatever else cerebral palsy brings. And that, as Claire said, gives me a joy. And it's not easy to be joyful when you're in pain, but joy isn't dependent on our circumstances. It's so much deeper and so much stronger. And so I try to make the most of every day, not complaining, but looking for the positives and living life to the full. And that, I guess, is the difference that having the hope that Jesus brings in my life makes when I face those challenges.
Adrian, thank you so much.